The house stood silent against the Virginia sky, its white columns glowing in the first light of dawn. Visitors admired its beauty. Historians praised the genius who designed it. School children learned that it belonged to one of America's greatest founding fathers. Yet beneath the polished floors and behind carefully preserved walls lived a story that generations tried not to tell. It was a story whispered only in private, hidden inside family memories, buried beneath politics, pride, and power. For more than 200 years, one question haunted Monticello like an echo that refused to disappear. Who were the children whose faces carried the unmistakable features of the man who declared that all men are created equal? Long before arguments filled books and courtrooms, before scientists examined strands of DNA, before descendants searched for the truth, there was only silence. And inside that silence lived a young enslaved girl whose future would become tied forever to one of the most famous names in American history. Her name was Sally Hemings, and her life would unfold in the shadow of a nation struggling to define freedom while denying it to thousands. The deeper one looks into her story, the more impossible it becomes to separate the ideals of America from the people who paid the price for them. The year was 1773 when Sally Hemings was born into slavery in colonial Virginia. She entered a world where an enslaved child's future was decided before the first breath was taken. There were no choices, no promises, only ownership. Every sunrise belonged to someone else. Every dream required permission that would never come. Monticello, perched high above the Virginia countryside, was unlike any other plantation. Its owner, Thomas Jefferson, was a man fascinated by architecture, science, philosophy, music, and books. He filled his home with inventions, rare plants, elegant furniture, and thousands of volumes from around the world. Visitors described him as thoughtful and brilliant. They admired his intelligence and his calm demeanor. Yet Monticello depended upon the labor of hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children. Their hands shaped every stone, harvested every field, prepared every meal, stitched every garment, and cared for every comfort enjoyed inside the grand mansion. While Jefferson studied liberty, they lived under bondage. Every beautiful room rested upon invisible suffering. Among those enslaved families was the Hemings family, whose story was unusually complicated even by the standards of slavery. Sally's mother, Betty Hemings, occupied a unique place within the plantation. Over the years, historians uncovered evidence that Betty herself was the daughter of an enslaved African woman and an English sea captain. That mixed ancestry would continue through Sally, making her three-quarters European by ancestry. Yet under Virginia law, none of that mattered. A single legal definition erased every part of her identity except one. She was property. The Hemings family possessed remarkable skills. Some became talented carpenters, blacksmiths, chefs, seamstresses, and craftsmen whose work impressed visitors from across the young nation. Their abilities brought them closer to the main house than many other enslaved workers, but proximity to power never meant freedom. Instead, it often demanded even greater obedience. As Sally grew older, she learned to move quietly through the halls of Monticello, She watched conversations she could never join. She witnessed celebrations she could never truly share. Every elegant dinner, every political discussion, every musical performance reminded her that she stood on the opposite side of a line she could not cross. Then tragedy reshaped everything. Jefferson's wife, Martha, died in 1782 after years of illness and repeated childbirth. Her death devastated him. Those who knew Jefferson described him wandering through the estate in grief, unable to speak for days. He withdrew into silence, consumed by sorrow. Friends feared he might never recover. But even in mourning, life at Monticello continued. Crops had to be harvested, meals prepared, clothes washed, children raised. The enslaved community carried the weight of daily survival, while the master's grief became part of history. Only a few years later, another opportunity and another turning point arrived. In 1784, Thomas Jefferson accepted a diplomatic appointment to France, representing the young United States abroad. Paris dazzled visitors with grand avenues, magnificent palaces, fashionable salons, and revolutionary ideas. Jefferson traveled there with members of his household, but not all of his children accompanied him immediately. Eventually, one of his daughters, Maria, was sent to join him. She was still a child, too young to make such a journey alone. Someone had to accompany her across the Atlantic. That responsibility fell to 14-year-old Sally Hemings. She boarded the ship not as a traveler seeking adventure, but as an enslaved servant. The Atlantic crossing was long, dangerous, and exhausting. Storms battered wooden ships. Disease spread easily in cramped quarters. Endless waves separated passengers from everything familiar. When Sally finally stepped onto French soil, she entered a world unlike anything she had ever known. France was far from perfect, but its laws differed dramatically from those of Virginia. Slavery had little legal standing in mainland France. Enslaved people brought there could often petition for their freedom. Many Americans living in Paris quietly paid wages to their servants because the legal system offered different protections. For the first time in her life, Sally existed in a place where freedom was not merely an impossible dream. It stood within reach. Paris overwhelmed the senses. Elegant gardens bloomed with flowers from distant lands. Horse-drawn carriages rolled across cobbled streets. Bells echoed from ancient churches. Markets overflowed with bread, fruit, silk, spices, and voices speaking languages from every corner of Europe. Some historians believe Sally received wages while in France. She learned French customs, fashionable dress, and life beyond the rigid boundaries of Virginia plantations. She observed women walking freely through the city without masters watching every movement. She saw possibilities that slavery had hidden from her since birth, and perhaps for the first time, she imagined another future. It was during these years in Paris that the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings is believed to have begun. The exact details remain unknown because history rarely preserved the voices of enslaved women. No diary written by Sally survives. No letters tell her thoughts. Much of what scholars know comes from later testimony by her son Madison Hemings, family recollections, surviving documents, and careful historical research. According to Madison's later account, Sally became pregnant while living in France. Faced with the possibility of returning to Virginia and slavery, she reportedly resisted leaving. Under French law, she might have remained free. Jefferson, however, needed his household to return home. What happened next would shape generations. Madison Hemings later recalled that Jefferson promised Sally something extraordinary. If she returned with him to Virginia, the children born from their relationship would eventually be freed when they reached adulthood. No written contract survives. No witnesses signed such an agreement. Yet the promise echoes through history because later events appeared to follow it with remarkable consistency. Imagine the impossible decision before a 16-year-old enslaved girl. Remain alone in a foreign country with uncertain prospects, or return across the ocean to a plantation where she would once again become property, trusting a promise made by one of the most powerful men in America. It was not a choice between freedom and slavery alone. It was a choice between loneliness and family, uncertainty and familiarity, hope and fear. Whatever her reasoning, Sally boarded the ship back to Virginia. The Atlantic seemed colder on the return journey. Each wave carried her farther from legal freedom and closer to the world that claimed ownership over her body, her labor, and soon her children. When Monticello finally appeared again on the Virginia hillside, nothing looked different. The same trees lined the road. The same fields stretched toward the horizon. The same grand house overlooked the mountain. But everything had changed. Within those walls, a secret had returned from France. Over the coming years, Sally Hemings gave birth multiple times. Historical records indicate that several of her children died in infancy, a heartbreaking reality common in the 18th century. Yet others survived, growing into adulthood under extraordinary circumstances. Observers began noticing something unusual. Jefferson freed no intact enslaved family during his lifetime. Yet members of the Hemings family received treatment, unlike almost anyone else at Monticello. Several of Sally's surviving children were allowed skilled work rather than brutal field labor. Some quietly left the plantation without being pursued. Others were formally emancipated. The pattern attracted attention even during Jefferson's own lifetime. Rumors spread through Virginia. Political enemies whispered them first. Newspapers hinted at them next. Neighbors quietly repeated them over dinner tables. Some dismissed the stories as malicious attacks against a famous statesman. Others believed they reflected an uncomfortable truth hiding in plain sight. Inside Monticello, however, silence remained the strongest rule. Children grew, secrets deepened, and every passing year made the truth more dangerous than the last. The man whose words inspired revolutions around the world was living beside children many believed were his own, children born into slavery, despite sharing the blood of one of America's most celebrated founders. Outside the plantation, the young nation marched toward an uncertain future, arguing endlessly about liberty, equality, and human rights. Inside Monticello, Those ideals were being tested every single day. And before long, whispers would become accusations that neither Jefferson nor the country could ever fully escape. The whispers began quietly, carried through candlelit parlors and courthouse corridors, exchanged in lowered voices whenever Thomas Jefferson's name entered the conversation. At first, they sounded like little more than political gossip. America was a young nation, fiercely divided, and few men attracted more admiration or more resentment than the author of the Declaration of Independence. Yet some rumors refused to disappear. They survived elections, scandals, and even the passing of years because they were rooted in something people believed they could see with their own eyes. At Monticello, life continued with the rhythm of the seasons. Spring awakened the orchards. Summer covered the hills in green. Autumn filled the air with the scent of harvested tobacco and wheat, and winter wrapped the mountaintop in silence. To visitors, the estate appeared peaceful, almost timeless. They admired Jefferson's inventions, his gardens, and the breathtaking view stretching across the Virginia countryside. But for the enslaved community, each season carried the same certainty. Work began before sunrise and often ended long after darkness had settled over the mountain. Every hour belonged to someone else. Every family lived with the knowledge that tomorrow could bring separation, punishment, or sale. Sally Hemings understood that reality better than anyone. She lived close enough to the main house to hear music drifting through open windows. She watched distinguished guests arrive in elegant carriages while enslaved servants hurried to prepare meals that would be remembered long after the names of those who cooked them had been forgotten. Presidents, diplomats, military officers, scholars, and foreign visitors praised Monticello as a symbol of American brilliance. Few paused to ask who polished the silver, washed the clothes, or carried the firewood through bitter winters. Hidden within that world were Sally's children. Each birth brought both joy and fear. Joy because new life entered a family that loved fiercely despite living in bondage. Fear because every child born to an enslaved mother inherited her legal condition. Under Virginia law, it did not matter who the father was. Whether a child shared the blood of a laborer or a president, the law declared only one truth. The child belonged to the master. That cruel reality transformed motherhood into a constant battle against dread. Sally could protect her children from scraped knees or winter cold, but she could never fully protect them from the system that claimed ownership over their futures. One by one, her surviving children grew older. Beverly, Harriet, Madison, Estone, each inherited more than a family name. Contemporary accounts later described them as having remarkably light complexions, so much so that some visitors reportedly struggled to believe they were legally enslaved. Their appearance became another source of whispered speculation throughout Virginia. People noticed. They always notice what others try hardest to conceal. Among Jefferson's political enemies, none proved more determined than journalist James Thompson Callender. Once an ally, Callender turned bitter after failing to receive the government appointment he expected. Seeking revenge, he began publishing explosive accusations against Jefferson. In 1802, the scandal erupted into public view. Callender claimed that Thomas Jefferson had fathered children with an enslaved woman named Sally. The accusations spread rapidly through newspapers across the young republic. Supporters dismissed it as slander. Opponents repeated it endlessly. Neither side possessed undeniable proof. Yet the allegation refused to fade. Jefferson himself chose silence. He issued no public denial. He held no dramatic press conference. He offered no written explanation to the American people. Instead, he continued serving as President of the United States, while the controversy followed him from city to city like an invisible shadow. Silence can be powerful. Sometimes it protects, sometimes it condemns, and sometimes it leaves future generations searching for answers that should have been spoken aloud. Back at Monticello, Sally continued raising her children within impossible circumstances. She occupied a place unlike almost anyone else on the plantation. She remained legally enslaved. She possessed no legal rights over her own life. Yet evidence suggests she was allowed privileges rarely granted to others in bondage. She worked primarily within the domestic household rather than in the fields. Her children trained in skilled trades instead of enduring the harshest agricultural labor. To outsiders, those differences appeared unusual. To those inside Monticello, they raised questions few dared ask openly. The children themselves grew up in two worlds. One world reminded them every day that they were enslaved. The other quietly hinted that their lives would not follow the same path as everyone around them. Imagine their confusion. They watched white visitors greet Thomas Jefferson with admiration and respect. They listened as people praised him as a champion of liberty. Yet they could never publicly call him father. No birthday celebrations acknowledged that bond. No family portraits included them. No legal documents recognized what many believed to be true. They lived close enough to see him almost every day while remaining separated by laws stronger than blood. For Madison and Estone, those silent contradictions became part of childhood itself. Meanwhile, Jefferson's public reputation continued to grow. After serving 2 terms as president, he retired to Monticello in 1809. Visitors arrived from across America and Europe hoping to meet the aging statesman. They described his intelligence, his hospitality, and his endless curiosity. They walked through libraries containing thousands of books. They admired scientific instruments collected from distant countries. They discussed philosophy, government, agriculture, and education. Few understood that just beyond the elegant rooms stood an entirely different community whose lives made that intellectual world possible. The enslaved workers maintained gardens, forged iron, built furniture, cooked elaborate meals, produced nails in Jefferson's nailery, cleaned every room, cared for livestock, harvested crops. Their labor financed the comfort surrounding one of America's greatest thinkers. Yet Jefferson himself faced mounting financial troubles. Despite owning vast amounts of land, he struggled with debt throughout much of his life. Years of expensive building projects, generous hospitality, Declining tobacco prices and inherited obligations placed enormous pressure upon his finances. Debt was not merely an inconvenience. For enslaved families, it represented terror. Creditors often demanded human property as payment. Entire families could disappear overnight. Children could be sold hundreds of miles away. Parents might never see them again. Every rumor about Jefferson's debts echoed through the cabins where enslaved families lived. No one knew who might be taken next. For Sally, the fear carried an additional weight. She remembered the promise reportedly made in France many years earlier. Would Jefferson keep his word, or would financial desperation erase even that fragile agreement? As the years passed, something remarkable began to happen. Beverly Hemings left Monticello around 1822. He simply departed. Jefferson made no serious effort to capture or return him. Soon afterward, Harriet Hemings also left. Again, pursuit appears to have been minimal. Both disappeared into white society, where historians believe they lived the remainder of their lives, passing as white Americans. It was an extraordinary decision. Passing meant safety. Passing also meant abandoning nearly everything familiar. Family ties had to be hidden. Personal history had to be rewritten. Even memories became dangerous. To survive, they would carry a secret for the rest of their lives. Imagine Harriet walking into a new town. No chains, no overseer, no legal owner. Only one overwhelming question. If no one knew she had once been enslaved, who could she become? Freedom often demands sacrifice. For Harriet and Beverly, the price may have been their own past. Back at Monticello, Madison and Estone remained. They continued working while vanish into uncertain futures. Perhaps they wondered when their own time would come. Perhaps they feared it never would. No surviving letters reveal their private thoughts. History rarely preserved the voices of enslaved children. Instead, their emotions must be found between the lines of legal records and family memories. Then came the final years. Thomas Jefferson grew older. His once dark hair turned white. His health weakened. Walking became more difficult. The brilliant mind remained active, but the burdens surrounding him increased. Debt tightened its grip. The plantations struggled financially. America itself stood divided over slavery with growing intensity. The contradiction that had existed since the nation's birth was becoming impossible to ignore. How could a country built upon liberty continue to tolerate human bondage? Jefferson had wrestled with that question throughout his life, writing that slavery was morally troubling while continuing to own hundreds of enslaved people. His words inspired freedom. His actions remained bound to slavery. That contradiction became one of the greatest paradoxes in American history. On July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, Thomas Jefferson died at Monticello. Church bells rang. Newspapers praised his achievements. Across America, citizens mourned the passing of a founding father. But on the mountaintop, another reality unfolded. Creditors quickly moved to settle Jefferson's massive debts. The estate could not pay what it owed, Everything had value: furniture, books, livestock, land, and people. The auction that followed shattered lives. Enslaved men, women, and children who had spent decades together faced the nightmare they had always feared. Families were separated. Friends disappeared. Children watched parents sold away. Parents watched sons and daughters vanish forever. The mountain that had witnessed generations of hidden lives echoed with grief. Yet amid that devastation, Jefferson's reported promise to Sally Hemings was not entirely forgotten. In accordance with his will, Madison and Estone Hemings were legally freed after his death. Sally herself was never formally emancipated in writing. Instead, Jefferson's daughter, Martha Randolph, allowed her to leave Monticello and live as a free woman in practical terms, though Virginia law technically remained complicated. After decades spent in the shadows of one of America's most famous homes, Sally finally walked away, not as a celebrated figure, not as a recognized member of Jefferson's family, not even as a woman whose story could be openly told. She departed quietly, carrying memories no history book had yet chosen to record. For many Americans, the matter seemed settled. Jefferson's legacy would endure. The rumors would eventually fade. The hidden family would disappear into history. But history has an extraordinary habit of waiting patiently. Sometimes it waits decades, sometimes centuries, and sometimes, when the last witnesses are gone and the truth seems permanently buried, science, forgotten letters, and determined descendants begin uncovering secrets that no amount of silence can keep hidden forever. The greatest revelation was still more than a century away. For generations, the mountain remained quiet. The voices that had once echoed through Monticello faded one by one. The footsteps of enslaved workers disappeared from its workshops. The laughter of children who had grown up in the shadows of the great house became nothing more than distant memories carried by their descendants. Visitors continued climbing the hill to admire Thomas Jefferson's architecture, his gardens, and the birthplace of so many American ideals. Guides spoke of independence, philosophy, and the birth of a nation. But another family lingered in silence. Their names rarely appeared in school books. Their portraits did not hang beside Jefferson's. Their memories survived around family tables, passed from grandparents to grandchildren, whispered with the hope that one day someone might finally believe them. For decades, America chose the easier story. Many respected historians insisted that the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings could never have happened. Some claimed Jefferson's political enemies had invented the scandal to destroy his reputation. Others suggested that different members of the Jefferson family had fathered Sally's children instead. The debate became fierce. Books argued one side. Newspapers defended another. Scholars spent years examining letters, plantation records, diaries, travel schedules, and family traditions. Every small clue seemed to create another question instead of an answer. Yet, while historians argued, Sally Hemings' own descendants continued telling the same story. They believed Thomas Jefferson was their ancestor. Generation after generation, they preserved that belief, even when many refused to listen. Across the country, descendants of the Jefferson family preserved a very different tradition. Many rejected the claim entirely. To them, Jefferson represented the highest ideals of the American Revolution. Accepting the story of Sally Hemings felt impossible, even threatening. The debate was no longer simply about history. It had become personal. Family identity stood on trial. The truth appeared locked away forever because the two people who knew it best had left behind almost no direct written record. Thomas Jefferson never publicly acknowledged Sally Hemings as the mother of his children. Sally herself left no diary explaining her life. Silence had become history's greatest obstacle. Then, more than 170 years after Jefferson's death, science entered the conversation. In the late 20th century, researchers realized that modern DNA testing might answer questions that written records never could. It was an extraordinary idea. Instead of relying only on old letters and fading memories, scientists could examine inherited genetic markers carried through generations. The investigation focused on the Y chromosome, passed almost unchanged from father to son. Researchers collected DNA samples from male descendants of the Jefferson family. They also obtained samples from descendants of Estone Hemings, Sally's youngest surviving son. If no relationship existed, the genetic lines would not match. If they did, centuries of debate could suddenly change. When the results became public in 1998, they shocked historians around the world. The Y chromosome carried by Estone Hemings descendants matched the Jefferson male line. The findings did not identify Thomas Jefferson with absolute biological certainty because several Jefferson men shared that paternal line. But historians compared another crucial piece of evidence. Thomas Jefferson was present at Monticello during every known conception of Sally Hemings' surviving children. Other Jefferson men often were not. When travel records, plantation documents, family testimony, and DNA evidence were examined together, many scholars concluded that Thomas Jefferson was by far the most likely father. The conversation changed almost overnight. Institutions that had rejected the possibility for cooperation began re-examining their conclusions. Historical organizations reopened investigations. Experts carefully reviewed decades of scholarship. The evidence had become too significant to ignore. Monticello itself faced a difficult decision. For many years, tours had largely avoided the subject. Visitors heard little about Sally Hemings, even less about her children. Now, the estate confronted a question larger than historical interpretation. Could the full story of Monticello be told without acknowledging the people whose labor and whose lives had shaped it? Gradually, the answer became clear. The house on the mountain was more than Jefferson's home. It was also the home of hundreds of enslaved people whose stories deserved to stand beside his. Today, visitors to Monticello learn not only about the author of the Declaration of Independence, but also about Sally Hemings, the Hemings family, and the enslaved community that sustained the plantation. Rooms connected to Sally's life have been researched and interpreted. Archaeologists uncovered evidence that helped reconstruct forgotten spaces. Family histories, once dismissed as legend, gained recognition within one of America's most visited historic sites. Yet recognition did not erase pain. For the descendants of Sally Hemings, acknowledgement came after centuries of silence. Some spent their entire lives fighting simply to have their family story treated with dignity. Many had grown up hearing relatives insist that history had ignored them. Now, museums, historians, and scholars were finally saying what their grandparents had always believed. Still, another challenge remained. The descendants of Thomas Jefferson and the descendants of Sally Hemings shared more than history. They shared blood. That realization forced difficult conversations about family, race, memory, and identity. In some cases, descendants reached across generations of division. They met one another. They listened to stories that had long been separated. Some discovered unexpected compassion. Others continued to struggle with painful emotions. Healing proved far more complicated than proving biological relationships. History rarely offers simple endings. Sally Hemings herself remains in many ways an elusive figure. No recorded interview captures her voice. No personal journal reveals her private fears. No surviving letters explain what she truly felt about Thomas Jefferson. Did she love him? Did she fear him? Did she resent him? Did she simply do what survival demanded? The honest answer is that no one can know with certainty. The enormous imbalance of power between an enslaved woman and the man who legally owned her means historians cannot fully reconstruct the emotional reality of their relationship. What can be said with confidence is that Sally lived within a system that denied her legal freedom and autonomy. Her choices were shaped by circumstances that no free person can easily imagine. Perhaps that uncertainty is itself part of the tragedy. The woman at the center of one of America's most debated historical stories left behind almost no words of her own. Others argued over her life, while her own voice remained almost entirely absent. Yet her children refused to disappear. Madison Hemings eventually gave interviews describing his family's history. As Stone Hemings built a life after emancipation, and his descendants continued carrying the family story into future generations. Their determination preserved a history that might otherwise have vanished forever. As the years passed, Monticello itself transformed from a private plantation into a place of remembrance. Visitors no longer walk only through the elegant rooms where presidents once dined. They also stand in workshops where enslaved craftsmen labored. They visit burial grounds where generations of enslaved families were laid to rest. They hear names that history once overlooked. Every restored room tells two stories at once. One is the story of extraordinary political vision. The other is the story of extraordinary human contradiction. Thomas Jefferson wrote words that inspired oppressed people around the world. His declaration that all men are created equal became a beacon for countless struggles for freedom. Yet the same man spent most of his life surrounded by people he legally owned. That contradiction cannot be erased. Neither can his achievements. History demands that both truths stand together. Perhaps that is why the story of Sally Hemings continues to resonate across generations. It is not simply a tale about a famous man and an enslaved woman. It is the story of a nation wrestling with its own conscience. It asks whether greatness can exist alongside profound injustice. It challenges us to remember those whose names were pushed into the margins while others stood in the spotlight. And it reminds us that silence is never the same as absence. For more than 2 centuries, Sally Hemings's family waited in the shadows while the world celebrated Monticello. The house remained. The secrets remained. The descendants remained. Eventually, the truth, or as close to it as history could reach, emerged not because powerful people chose to reveal it, but because ordinary families refused to let their memories die. Today, when the evening sun settles over the Virginia hills and long shadows stretch across the gardens of Monticello, it touches every corner of the estate equally. It falls upon Jefferson's magnificent home. It falls upon the workshops built by enslaved hands. It falls upon the graves of those whose names were almost forgotten. And it falls upon the memory of a young girl who crossed an ocean as someone else's property, returned carrying a secret that would outlive presidents, generations, and centuries of denial, and whose children would one day force history to confront the truth it had tried so hard to leave behind. Sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones carved into monuments. They are the ones whispered from parent to child until the world is finally ready to listen. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all, not simply that a hidden family was discovered, but that history itself proved incapable of burying them forever.